Welcome to the podcast. I'm Michelle.
And I'm Tiffany.
Welcome to the Sensory Lounge podcast. On this podcast, we share both fiction and nonfiction stories. Our fictional stories are told as ASMR bedtime stories. And our nonfiction stories, well, we have a great one for you today. You want to tell them about it, Tiffany?
Yes. It's called Whispers of the Lake, What Lies Beneath, and it's describing Lake Lanier and what has happened in history and its current events. Stay tuned and we'll get into our story.
So, to prepare for tonight's podcast, we did our own investigation, and here's what we found. Our investigation takes us back to the 20th century to a town called Oscarville. Oscarville was a predominantly black town with about 250 families and about 1,100 people. These people were professionals who owned their land and their homes, as well as their businesses such as churches, barbershops, and other professions' general stores. Oscarville is located in Forsyth County near the Chattahoochee River. The Chattahoochee River is located in the southern United States, primarily flowing through the states of Georgia and Alabama. It originates in the Blue Ridge Mountains of northern Georgia and flows south and southwest for approximately 430 miles or 700 kilometers before merging with the Flint River at the Georgia-Florida state line to form the Apalachicola River. The river flows southwestward through northern Georgia, passing through or near several cities, including Gainesville and Columbus. In the Atlanta metropolitan area, it serves as a vital water source and recreation area, including the creation of Lake Lanier, which we'll talk about later.
Another important place in our story is the neighboring town, Cumming, Georgia. The neighboring town, Cumming, Georgia, like many small southern towns, was a community deeply rooted in agriculture and had relatively modest population. Agriculture, the backbone of Cumming's economy, and its surrounding areas were primarily engaged in farming, with cotton, corn, and various other crops being the main agricultural products. Many residents worked as farmers, and the town would have had businesses such as cotton gins, grist mills, and general stores to support a local agricultural community. The town center consisted of courthouses, a few stores, churches, and a school. People in the town knew each other well, and social gatherings and the community events were important aspects of life. Like many towns in South America during this time, Cumming would have been racially segregated with separate facilities and services for African Americans and white residents. The segregation was enforced by Jim Crow laws.
Jim Crow laws were a system of racial segregation and discrimination that existed in the United States during this period. While the area was predominantly occupied by whites, Jim Crow laws reinforced segregation in the area, forcing many blacks into surrounding towns that were less developed and more economically challenged, like Oscarville. Jim Crow laws' discriminatory practices extended to the workplace, with African Americans often regulated to low-paying, menial jobs. Labor unions also discriminated against non-white workers. Schools for African American children were typically underfunded and provided inferior services compared to schools for white children. This unequal education perpetuated racial disparities. While not codified in Jim Crow laws themselves, racial violence and intimidation were common methods of enforcing segregation and suppressing civil rights activism. Lynchings and other forms of violence were used to terrorize African American communities.
There were two major events that caused racial controversy between Oscarville and Cumming, Georgia. In September 1912, and two separate alleged attacks on white women in the Cumming area resulted in black men being accused as suspects. On the night of September 5th, 1912, a white woman named Ellen Grice alleged that a black man entered her bedroom. He startled her awake and she screamed out in fear, causing him to flee. She contacted the Forsyth County Police Department, and within days, Forsyth County Sheriff William Reed detained suspect Tony Howell and his alleged accomplices Johnny Bates, Fate Chester, Isaiah Perkle, and Joe Rogers. The 5 black men were placed in the small Forsyth County Jail located near Cumming Town Square. After the incarceration of the black men, a local African American activist and preacher, Grant Smith, was the first to speak out. However, his comments were not only derogatory towards the white victim, but set off a nearly fatal turn of events. Smith referred to the victim as a sorry white woman, which enraged the town's white men, who quickly responded by beating Smith within inches of his life. Forsyth County sheriffs eventually dragged him into the courthouse, saving his life. Guards were stationed to protect Smith from further violence and to prevent the courthouse from being stormed. Smith was later transferred out of town for his safety, and no one was charged with his assault. Rumors began to swirl about the possible race riots. Rumors were spreading that the blacks in the community would set off explosives in the town. Armed white men strolled through the streets to keep law and order. Fearing a race riot, Governor Joseph Mackey Brown declared martial law and activated 23 members of the National Guard from Gainesville, who successfully kept the peace along with other Guard members from Marietta, Georgia. Later that day, Sheriff Reed sent Howell, his 4 alleged accomplices, and Smith to the Cobb County Jail for their protection. Smith was released. Thinking that the angry mob from Cumming was en route to Marietta, Governor Brown arranged for the 5 prisoners to be moved for their own protection, this time to Fulton County Jail in Atlanta. Tony Howell was charged with the assault with the attempt to rape Ellen Grice, which later was dropped in 1913.
So the second major event or crime that happened that sparked the race riot between Oscarville and Cumming was the story of May Crow. On September 8, 1912, 18-year-old May Crow was walking from home to her aunt's house nearby on Browns Bridge Road along the Forsyth-Hall County line when she went missing. The next day, searchers found the missing girl around noon in the secluded woods about a mile from her house. She was lying face down in a pool of blood and her throat had been slashed. She was still alive and breathing shallowly. Crow later died of her injuries. At the scene, searchers found a small pocket mirror that was said to belong to a Ernest Knox, a 16-year-old black boy. Police arrested him at home, taking him to Hall County Jail in Gainesville to avoid the strife already brewing in Cumming. On the way, it was said that Knox confessed to the attack on Crow after being subject to a form of torture known as mock lynching. It was said that Knox struck Crow from behind and dragged her down a gully in the woods. He allegedly assaulted the girl with a rock, and around midnight that day, Knox returned to the scene with 3 accomplices: Oscar Daniel, 17, Oscar's sister Trussie Jane Daniel, 22, and Jane's live-in boyfriend Rob Edwards, 24. The men reportedly satisfied their lustful passions on the girl. That night, police officers took Knox by car to Atlanta to prevent a lynching, as word had spread on the attack on Crow, and white lynch mobs began to form that afternoon at the Gainesville jail.
The lynching of Rob Edwards. The next day, September 9th, Robert Edwards was arrested in connection with the attack on Crow and was taken to the county jail in Cumming. It is said that after placing Edward in the jail, Sheriff Reed left, leaving his deputy to protect the jail and its prisoner. Later that day, the lynch mob returned to the jail, armed with sticks, clubs, ropes, and whips. They forced their way into the jail. Once inside, they quickly overtook the small jail and gained access to Edwards. Dragging him from his cell, he was brutally attacked, shot, and lynched. The trail of reigning defendants. Oscar Daniel and his sister Tressie Daniel were also arrested as suspects, and their neighbor Ed Collins was held as a witness for the trial held on October 3rd in Cumming, Georgia. The governor again declared martial law. Martial law is the state of affairs in which the military takes control of civilian government functions, often in response to a crisis emergency. During martial law, the military authority supersedes the normal civilian government, and the military is granted broad powers to maintain order and security as the governor felt needed at the time. At the trial, Tressie Daniel testified as a witness and recounted the midnight attack on the victim by the men. An all-white jury of farmers and one night watchmen quickly convicted Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel of rape and murder. The following day, October 4th, both teenagers were sentenced to death by hanging, and it was scheduled for October 25th. During this time, law prohibited public hangings. The scheduled execution was only to be viewed by the victim's family, a minister, and law officers. Gallows were built off the square in Cumming, a fence erected around the gallows to keep the executions private. The night before the scheduled hangings, a fence was burned down. A crowd of between 5,000 and 8,000, which was more than half of the population of 12,000 residents, gathered to watch what became a public hanging of the two youths.
So Forsyth County was the site of the most successful racial cleansing of Black communities in American history. After the trial and execution, scores of white men known as night riders from Cherokee County and other nearby counties threatened and intimidated Black residents. Many families, fearing for their safety, either fled or were killed, and their properties were stolen from them. Those that left fled to nearby Hall and Gwinnett County. As estimated, 98% of the Black residents living in the county left due to night riders' threats, or they were murdered. Some property owners were able to sell, likely at a loss. The renters and sharecroppers left to seek safer places. Those who had to abandon property and failed to continue paying property tax eventually lost their lands, and whites took it over. Many Black landowners' property titles ended up in the hands of whites without a sale or without the transfer of title. Much of the land was in the village of Oscarville. This was no surprise with the European American history that started in the 1800s with the U.S. government forcing the Cherokee Nation, which led to the Trail of Tears, then the racial cleansing of a thriving Black town. In the 1920s and 30s, there was an intense effort to force Black people and the mass transferring of their land to white landowners. The racial cleansing started in Oscarville, but did not stop there. Parts of the stolen land would be sold to the U.S. government, and by 1950, plans to build Lake Lanier were in full effect. Soon, to support the growing demand for water in nearby cities, the rest of Forsyth County was untouched and remained an all-white county for several more decades. Thousands of acres of farmland destroyed, hundreds of families displaced, and 20 Black cemeteries submerged. Stay tuned for part 2.